Hello again. We're going to continue with the A's here from World of Ideas. A couple of them here. I'm going to read portions of it and just sort of go through this fairly quickly with this. Again, I know some of the other videos got rather lengthy. So this one, we're going to go with alienation. So one word, not two words, as in an alien nation, but alienation. So, separation from the activity, principle, or creative force that forms one's essential self, or detachment from one's inherited social traditions. The alienated person feels isolated, powerless, and apathetic, like an alien in one's own society or a stranger in one's own skin. Um, so, a lot of this talks about a lot of things in comparative philosophy with this. Um, they talk about a dialectical method, dialectical being like Socrates and Socrates for bloody hell, Socrates and Plato would use. In other words, there's it's dialogue. It's kind of a two-person dialogue, and it go was it thesis, antithesis, synthesis. I think is the way the pattern with that goes. So I say something, you say something that's kind of the opposite, and we work out the sort of truth in between. And Marxism and a few other things they talk about in there, but it's the general idea, and this will also again come psychologically, and going back and when we talked about almost affirmative action with that too, where for whatever reason you're almost like losing connection with things. So there's again the separation. In a larger context, much larger context, separation is sort of like the ultimate illusion. And, some people who sort of suffer what would they consider a crisis of faith or spirituality talk about feeling this alienation. There's something out there that they're not part of. It could be alienation, especially now. Like this is huge now because we're still in the sort of COVID-19 lockdown with that. So a lot of people are feeling alienated because they can't really have, they're used to a certain routine, they're used to a certain level of interaction with other people, certain freedom of movement. The way I sort of think of it, the option to go and do X, Y, or Z, go to a museum, go to a concert, do all this other stuff like that. Um, but it could also be other things as well. If we're talking about historically, you can talk about slavery or the Holocaust. These people ripped out away from their homes and everything along those lines, and then you know um, never seeing them again, being taught that kind of who they were and what they were was awful. Again, Holocaust, we have slavery, we have the way Western powers have treated indigenous populations all over the world. We had the Indian schools here in the United States, where the indigenous children were forced out of the reservations, made to cut their hair. They were just beaten all the heck and back if they were caught teaching or talking their traditional languages, and basically told that everything about their traditional society and everything else like that was wrong and evil, and we're here to save you. So even if that's a traumatic experience, and maybe home wasn't traumatic, when you get home, there's a dissonance there. You're going to feel alienated because you've been indoctrinated in this sort of like really traumatic sort of thing. So there's a certain almost disconnection from what you were before, but what you were before is still there, which is disconnected from what you were sort of put into. And if you get in a certain age with that, it starts as almost programmed long term with you and everything. So same thing can happen reactive attachment disorder psychologically, if people are in abusive relationships with significant others who sort of isolate them. That feeling of alienation starts coming. So now it's almost that doubles down where I can't go and talk to him because I don't have anyone to talk to or help me with this. Again, even with children, what resources do you have? If you're a child, stuff's going on, like what do you do? So this has a lot of things in terms of big stuff, in terms of cultures trying to isolate and alienate other cultures, in terms of even just an individual struggling with their own individual self. I think everyone on some level or another feels this in some fashion. Maybe not frequently in their lives, but in certain points in their lives. Being a teenager is a perfect example of an alienation sort of circumstance that everyone goes through. It's an awkward middle stage of life. You're not a child, you're not an adult, you don't know who you are. I'm sorry, you don't. I was a teenager too. My own subjective experience, let alone objective experience, in terms of study and psychology, as well as observing, working in youth, adolescent mental health for over a dozen years. You don't. And that's fine. You're not supposed to. You're not supposed to have everything figured out at 14, 15, 16, 18, 19 years old. Your brain isn't even an adult brain till like 26, something like that anyway. So it's okay. Um, but that is an alienating thing. So maybe you're even 28, 29, 30, 40 years old. You're kind of like, I don't have this figured out. I don't know what to do. That's still kind of alienating. The idea of maybe you lock into certain views of what your society says that you should be. At X age, you should have a house and be married and have kids and have a car and have a job and all that. And you don't at that age, or that's not something that appeals to you, that can be alienating too, because then it's just sort of like you might have family. When you get married, when you do it, it's like, we don't want to. Notice when you get family or you get the pressure from the older generations, or even people of your generation who are just buying lockstep into that, start pressuring it. And it's like, who the hell am I going to talk to about stuff now if everyone's coming down on me on this? And that's one of the sort of insidious, insipid things about having legitimate depression. I think everyone has a certain sort of dysthymic sort of thing once in a while, but actually having legitimate, consistent depression puts you in that mode all the time. So does anxiety, too, and a lot of times too. A lot of things will do that. People on the spectrum might feel certain alienation because they just can't communicate things the way they want to communicate. Now their routines are getting all messed up from that too, and then it's like, oh, what's the thing? I gotta adjust to this, and they legitimately have a hard time dealing with that. So alienation is actually has a certain idea in terms of philosophy, but is one of those things that really crosses a lot of other things throughout everyone's life. We're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about, I want to do analytic philosophy. So there's a couple names in this that kind of come up. And again, analytic thought, analysis, these are all things that are going to be important. You probably have heard, you will hear. You will be expected to have certain practical knowledge, so to speak, of as well. So analytic philosophy is a 20th century philosophical movement that stresses the analysis of statements, concepts, propositions, expressions, and logical constructs, while shunning metaphysical speculation. So, this is almost where like legal stuff, the legalese really gets in there, because it was like, oh, well, what does it mean when you say this? You're sitting there on the stand. Oh, well, wait a minute, because you said just a minute ago that you ran forth. Now you said you were running, and they start digging in on that sort of semantic, talking about the words that you use and how you use them and things like that. Sort of digging into that. It's like we're taking out any sort of thing about spirituality or any sort of other thing other than just the sort of reductionist thing of what this is right here, right now, what you said, what you meant with that. So its founder was Bertrand Russell, might be a name that you might have to know later on, who not only produced the version of symbolic propositional logic on which it relies, but was the first to apply it to the problems of philosophy, as opposed to the predicate or syllogistic logic derived from Aristotle, which considered the qualities of things. Propositional logic emphasized the analysis of logical propositions and seeks a formal language through which these propositions can be expressed more clearly. So those other ones would have talked about more things that were underlying it. Almost more subjective, Um, not doesn't necessarily have to be supernatural, but the idea of, we have Plato's allegory of the cave, which is, everyone's in this cave and there's a big fire in the middle, and what you see projected on the walls are just that. They're projections, they're not the real thing. But then someone goes out of the cave, is blinded by the light of truth, sees the real things, tries to go back in and tell everyone about it, and then they kill him for it. He was probably clearly thinking about his teacher Socrates with that, who that kind of happened for. But that's the idea. If what we see and what we experience is not the real world as the real world, we're experiencing projections of it. So almost like we're in the Matrix. And when they're talking about, no, what we're talking about, the words that we use and how we view the world is different from that. Pop, 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 pop. Okay, the genesis of analytic philosophy also owed much to Wittgenstein's, another name you might have to know, emphasis on the logical structure of language itself, and to the logical positivists' insistence that the validity of propositions be verified logically and empirically. So language as a science, basically. You hear logically and empirically, they're talking about a scientific way to look at language. So almost sort of stripping some of the meaning from it and making everything just across the board. This is going to mean this. When you say this, this means that. That's it. Skip that part. Analytic philosophy holds that ordinary language is inexact and thus unable to express philosophical truth. That's capital T truth. So philosophical truth isn't just, oh, well, I was honest and I told the teacher that I cheated on a test when I did. It's like we're talking about philosophical truth, big capital T. It's beyond just, telling the truth to your teacher, your parents, or something like that. Indeed, analytic philosophers have generally been more concerned with analyzing logic and linguistic relations than with seeking to determine the facts of the world. Again, instead of a lot of philosophy is almost sort of like a thought science, where now we're trying, philosophers will try to understand the meaning of, life, the universe, and everything in the world through the thought of it, and using those as thought experiments and so on, as opposed to like, a quantum physicist who's analyzing data from the Large Hadron Collider. So instead of trying to just go, oh, well, what's this big stuff and everything, we're trying to figure out words, how they're spoken, why they're spoken, in what contexts, and then the subjective meaning from that. Central to analytic philosophy are the logical analysis of linguistic structure and the precise definitions of terms. It is thus closely related to linguistic analysis, the branch of philosophy that aims to clarify the meanings of words in the context of the ideas and objects they represent. So again, just trying to take out some of that subjectivity. If you look at a dictionary, there might be, you look at one word and it's got 5 or 6 of those bullet point definitions of it, and some of them are wildly different. Not even counting homonyms, words that sound the same, there. For I am for breakfast food versus the number 4, FOUR. Those different thing homonyms with that. But you see, really trying to come up with. Well, I'm looking at dice. So you have a die that is cast or something like that. Die, D-I-E, is like 3-4 different meanings. One is you cease to live. One is like it's spelled differently, but it's said the same. D-Y-E is like the dye on your clothes or something like that. D-I-E is also having to deal with manufacturing. It's the plural for dice. It's like, well, this makes language, especially if we're talking about English, which has both a Latin and a Germanic base. And Latin was influenced by like Etruscan and Greek and even a little bit from Egyptian, sort of thing. The Neteru, or the Egyptian gods, the Neter, nature, and then we start having nature from that. We have chemistry, which even comes in through like Greek and Latin and stuff like that. But Kemet was the Egyptian name for Egypt, and then we get like, and then they had their whole civilization was sort of integrated together. Everything that was done was integrated together with like their sort of spiritual practices, and that's where you get the idea of alchemy, being able to take something and refine it to something better. It wasn't, the sort of baseline ugly version of it was turning lead into gold, but that was just a symbol for being able to transform the self. Take the body and matter and stuff that you have and be able to elevate it up into something more. So then we get the chemistry, alchemy from that. And we get the chemistry from alchemy, and all that comes from the name of Egypt. So we have that from like Egypt, and the Etruscans had language that come in through the Greeks and the Latins, and then the Latin was changed because it's Norman, when the Norman French invaded England in 1066, and French was considered the Latin vulgaire, which is sort of like the common language of some of the soldiers who were stationed in Gaul, which was France, were speaking. So it's not pure Latin, it was this sort of like changed Latin. And then you have the Anglos and the Saxons that were already in England beforehand, spoke different dialects of German or Germanic languages. So you have that. Then you have the Celts that were there throughout, especially like Scotland and Ireland and Wales, and you had the Picts who were up in Scotland as well. And then come the Vikings. So they have so like, English is this sort of mishmash of all this other stuff. So then you have words that sound similar and everything from these different languages, or they have these different meanings, and then over the past 1,000 years, different meanings start piling up. So you have one thing with 5 meanings, and they all mean something different. And then you have then different sort of regional understandings of things. You could go in a different part of the country and say, I like a pop, like punch you in the face. Like, what the hell are you talking about? Pop? You want me to punch you? What? Like, no, a pop. Like Coke, soda. If you don't say soda, there's some places in the United States that call all soda Coke. And then it's something Coke, Bubble Coke, whatever. Or they call soda pop, or they call pop, or they call soda. Someone might come even up around here, say, well, soda, and actually it's going to cause someone to go, and then they have to go realize, oh, you mean pop, that sort of thing. So even with a standardized sort of language, because English is fairly standardized at this point, we've got dictionaries and multiple countries that speak it and so on and so forth. We have multiple countries that speak it, and those have changed over the times and everything like that. So that's got a whole different change in things now too. But we have regional differences now and everything. So and then subjective differences. So now we're starting to talk about differences in education, differences in learning styles, because there's multiple learning styles too, different communication styles, and all this stuff builds in to make language fairly subjective. And then if you want to start talking about things like big T truth, or spirituality, or the soul, or any of these other things like that, or try and conceptualize love, then it becomes a whole other big ball of wax then too. So the idea of those analytical philosophers are trying to like scale that down and make things mean certain things so we can objectively understand each other, despite any of those differences, genetic, epigenetic, anything else like that. See, tying in some of the other ones. So a couple more A's for you, and we will get along, continue with that later. Thank you.